Good morning, everybody. My name is Renee.
I'm Miguel.
Welcome to Signals in the Noise, daily insights into trends in the narrative landscape. What do we mean by narrative landscape? Conversations unfold around us, reinforcing ideas, beliefs, and values that we interact with every day. We know narrative is not static. Stories and messages can both trickle up and trickle down, from local to national, from politicians to celebrities, and from influencers and micro-influencers who spread information in both centralized and decentralized ways. We're having some technical difficulties. EVA, are you back?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, perfect. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here.
Sorry, y'all. Good morning, everybody.
That's the nature of live broadcast.
Right?
On that point, our team combs through news articles, social media content, and websites. We then dissect content to identify conversations, messages, and stories. This allows us to identify the shape and color of how meaning is made in the landscape in which we're all organizing and communicating it. This is what we like to call monitoring the narrative weather.
And think of us as your resident meteorologist tracking the narrative weather across the country. Each morning, we'll walk you through the latest, where we cover stories of importance. Then we'll move to hot takes, where we look at viral content. We'll wrap things up with On the Radar, a segment where we talk about real-time stories we're tracking. With that, let's get into our first segment, the latest.
Okay, y'all, I'm struggling to figure out where we should even begin because so much is happening, so much is going on. Help me out.
Tell me about it. I mean, we definitely know that we don't have a clear winner as far as the president goes, so there's that.
You know, Miguel, I don't think you should tell the president that, because he said he already won, and the ballots that haven't been counted should just be thrown out already.
Oh, Lord. I'm just surprised that so many people are actually surprised that he'd be attacking, basic tenets of democracy. But the discourse has been interesting, to say the least. Trump has been threatening the vote for months, especially in his attacks on Democrat-run states and claims of a rigged election. He's also seeded narratives around his ownership of the Supreme Court and how he would wield it, especially with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, who, in addition to Justices Kavanaugh and Roberts, worked on the Bush versus Gore in 2000.
Yeah, you're right. But I think we need to celebrate some wins right now. So let me just say this. Over 120 million people have participated in this year's election, which shattered a century-old record. That's 100, right? That's huge, and it's due in large part to on-the-ground GOTV efforts around the country. However, somehow we still find ourselves in a black hole of stories and conversations, some of which honestly are giving me flashbacks to post-election 2016.
I hear you, EVA, but there are stories and conversations that are different, though. We've seen an increase in the number of content that fight back against the claim that it is somehow the fault of a monolithic group of voters that could potentially deliver Trump his sought-after re-election win. Regardless of who wins the presidency, though, this election has shown us that some American voters have a fidelity to white supremacy in ways that we can't ignore. In a conversation in the politics subreddit, comparisons between Trump's 2016 numbers at 63 million votes and his 2020 numbers at over 67 million votes means that the base of people motivated by his message, actions, and worldview grew. So much for the suburban wine moms pulling through for democracy.
Okay, quick question. How much wine do you have to drink to be considered one of those? Because minus the kids and the suburban mom part, I'm definitely drinking a lot of wine these days. Help me out.
Additional question: do non-human children count? I
What's the
just need to know so I can
Okay.
plan for the next phase of my career.
Facts. We can't deny the fact that the Trump campaign really doubled down on attracting Black men, not only through sophisticated disinformation campaigns, but through the rise of Blexit and the American descendants of slavery, or the ADOS fringe movement. They also appealed to masculinity, individualism, gun owners, and spread disinformation on Biden and Harris's records as elected officials. They've clearly been working real hard, y'all, real hard.
Clearly.
Just as we've seen support for Trump grow, we've seen encouraging increases in conversations challenging the current system of voting, with themes of abolishing the Electoral College, as well as the role of institutional racism in the election.
That's right. These conversations are moving through progressive activist circles, but also include scholars and journalists of color. Also, criticisms on the political commentator class in the media can be found across Twitter and Reddit, including tweets by Bree Newsom, who points out the hypocrisy of pundits focusing on Black and Latinx people as a small electorate who may have voted for Trump or third party, and not the majority of white folks who voted in favor of an outwardly fascist candidate.
I wish we could share all of Bree's tweets because she's always coming through with the facts. We're also friends in my head, but that's okay. Another conversation.
Straight up hot takes all the time.
All the time.
However, I do want to pause on your point, though. By blaming Black people and Latinx people, we let white voters off the hook. You know, we assume and expect them to just be racist and be guided by that racism in voting, even if those votes are against their own interests, you know, like healthcare or even welfare. This assumes that the only fix to racism in action is by Black people and people of color, not white people. This gets into all sorts of tropes about people of color that are just gross and definitely racist. Like, I'm not sure how many times we have to communicate this. Intentional or not, though, these pundits, the narrators of this election story, set up this story for us and point to very particular narratives. It's really lazy storytelling, and truthfully, I'm sick of it.
Girl, you are really preaching now. I'm really about to pull out the organ and start shouting because you're speaking some real facts.
Just do a praise dance real quick, you know?
Quick praise
around the perimeter.
By telling lazy stories, voters who are assumed bases for progressives are labeled as uneducated, unreachable, or politically unconscious, and make all sorts of strategic errors. One is the assumption that race and racism are the only concerns of these large groups. Take that and combine it with the old and never out of style narrative by racists everywhere that Black people in particular are less smart, or I've got another one, an even better one, less civilized than white people. Add that to the rules and practices built on that narrative that continue to limit, suppress, and straight up bar Black people and people of color from voting. And when it's all said and done, stories that blame voters of color very simply co-sign their disenfranchisement, which is just a lighter version of tyranny. Tyranny light, if you will.
Ooh, that's a good one. we need to tell stories about voting and outcomes that address race and gender and class and access and ability. Truly intersectional stories. The fact that there were lines during early voting that went on for hours during a pandemic, which we're still in, which I don't know why people keep forgetting this, while other voters had to navigate obstacles at the polls, is completely unacceptable.
Agreed. In messages that uplift election protection and voter resilience, we need to be sure that we're speaking up about how some politicians strategically try to use the election system to exclude voters, especially Black voters, who show up every election and still have to deal with suppression and disenfranchisement. We have to name these villains. This is just as important as uplifting stories of joy and honoring those who have fought for the right to vote, especially if we shift focus towards organizing and power building.
Sure. We could stay here in this conversation all day, but let's move on. In other interesting conversations on the election, we've spotted small but substantial conversations about the economy and about socialism.
Wait a minute. Is this the Bernie would have won this election in a landslide side of Reddit?
Hey, Bernie did all he could to help the Biden campaign. I hope that was a good enough answer, because I really don't want Bernie bros and socialist hot girls to come for us. So.
Socialist hot girls?
Well, not the socialist hot girls. That takes me out every time. So yes, some of it is pro-Bernie, and conversations highlight the fact that lots of folks do want some of those progressive policies that the GOP is scapegoating as socialist. Florida voted for a $15 minimum wage. Colorado voted for 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave. States like New Jersey and Montana voted to legalize marijuana, while DC and Oregon voted on decriminalizing psychedelics. Go drugs.
Drugs 2020. But you know what, Renee, though? This is not the conversation I thought we'd be having this morning. But please continue.
It's a good year for drugs, clearly.
It is.
All of these ballot initiatives and state amendments go back to the idea that we want to uplift that centers the will of the people, not candidates, and the futures that we want to build on. For many of us, voting is a strategy, not the means nor the end. And voting down the ballot is a clear way that voters co-sign the policies that say all of our lives matter.
All right, Evie and Renee, the wins that y'all mentioned remind me of something. Socialism is a boogeyman.
It's giving Casper. It's definitely giving Casper.
In all honesty, it's a red herring the right uses to confuse and suppress the vote of Latinx folks. Actually, that's kind of a great segue into the next segment, hot takes.
You know what, y'all? If the Latinx community wasn't a talking point before this election, they definitely are now.
To quote Lizzo, I've been waiting for this one.
let's get into it.
It definitely feels as though a lot of news outlets are just figuring out that Latinx people are not a monolith and that we're not all the same. And like Twitter user Will Frey says, I didn't ask to be lumped into a monolithic ethno-racial voting bloc. No más tuve suerte. With a large part of Cuban Americans voting for Trump in Florida, Mexican Americans helping to flip Arizona's historic Republican-led run, and Latino voting blocs emerging in other states as the ballots continue to be counted, it's becoming apparent that moving forward, we maybe can't put people from 33 different countries under one umbrella.
Child, welcome to the Monolith Club, Miguel. There's snacks in the back. Okay, what do you want? I don't know what it is with people thinking that all people of color think the same. I mean, I feel like this is a conversation that comes up every single election, especially within the Black community. As we discussed earlier, this is definitely not High School Musical. We're not all in this together. Communities of color in general are diverse when it comes to our lived experiences, and we should always and definitely be treated as such.
Yes. I love the choreography, guys. I love that.
I will say though, I'm not even religious, but amen on all that. I really don't get it though. Us Latinx folks, we can't even agree upon on what to call straws, popcorn, or cake in Spanish. We're all expected to be politically on the same page.
You know what, Miguel? Let's take Florida for an example here, right? Long before election night, Trump's campaign was more obsessed with the Cuban American vote than Eminem was with Mariah Carey back in the day.
Probably still is.
Yeah, most likely.
Yeah. A popular story from Politico.com lays out that while the Cuban American vote in Florida has been historically Republican, in recent years, the Democratic Party managed to start making a dent in it. I mean, Obama won the Cuban American vote on election night in 2012, and Hillary beat Trump there in 2016. So I think a lot of folks might have been banking on history repeating itself, no?
Mm-hmm. And you know what happens when you make assumptions. It rhymes with glass, okay? Rhymes with glass. This is where Trump and the GOP's obsession comes in. Like I said earlier, the Cuban American vote has been a talking point long before the actual election. Trump managed to win them back or keep them on the GOP side by hyper-focusing on the community there and stepping up their anti-socialist messaging.
Yeah, and in their Spanish ads, they use the Castro Chavismo line, which, if you know anything about Cubans, is definitely a rough subject. Not to mention, the Trump campaign also targeted other Southern Florida Latinx voters, like Venezuelans and Nicaraguans, as well as conservative Colombians.
Y'all, as a Colombian myself, I have a lot of thoughts on conservative Colombianos, but I'm not trying to get dragged online, so I'll keep my mouth. But what we saw play out, but what we saw play out was a barrage of misinformation and disinformation aiming to play on people's lived experience and real world fears and fabricating a socialist boogeyman in Biden and the Democratic Party. Trump stayed on message. One thing that boggles my mind is that the Democratic Party didn't seem to make an attempt to try to combat this misinformation, even when local groups on the ground were creating the messaging for them and literally putting it up on billboards across Florida.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, Renee, or Miguel, I'm sorry. It's definitely a missed opportunity. On the flip side, messaging based on people's lived experiences can work wonders when based in reality. You know, the reason that Arizona flipped blue would not have been possible without organizers on the ground doing the legwork, shout out to Lucha, and reminding folks that they had already lived through a xenophobic tyrant in their own backyard. By tying in Arizona's history in Maricopa County with Joe Arpaio and SB 1070, alongside shifting demographics, with more young Latinx folks registering to vote, the Democratic Party was able to get Joe Biden to become the second Democratic presidential candidate since 1948 to win the state.
And let's not forget, they also helped vote for retired astronaut Mark Kelly, which gave the party both Senate seats for the first time in nearly 70 years. It's almost as if values-based messaging has the power to move people to take action.
Who would have thought? Who would have thought?
If anything, we don't need to be focusing on which community gave who the win, but what messaging was used to make it happen.
Yeah, I feel like the narrative strategy used in this election is something we'll be studying moving forward. Now with that, let's move on to our last segment, On the Radar.
So we're tracking a story by WUS9 out of DC that originally reported the since redacted false claim that the Black Lives Matter activists stabbed a few Proud Boys during election night demonstrations. While the journalist has edited the story, the media outlet has still not updated the headline or their tweet. While the conversation is relatively small and has been shared by some leftists and Soledad O'Brien, we know that sensationalized stories will spread like wildfire and could potentially escalate, especially as so many people are on edge with the potential of right-wing violence.
Yeah. While we plan for community security, we should not elevate stories about violence and civil war. These stories bolster the right's frame that are rooted in racism and scapegoating people for organizing for Black freedom and opposing fascism as the drivers of violence in society. The idea of a civil war is a white nationalist frame that pulls from those same racist narratives. Instead of playing into their hands, we can de-escalate by lifting up victories, sharing our analysis of conditions that neutralize lies, using humor over rumor, because sometimes you just got to laugh at some of the stuff, and let's not forget the victories that we should be proud of.
For sure. This period will have a record amount of misinformation and disinformation. And while our team is small, we are scrappy, and we will continue to track the stories as they come up. And now, after reports that Nevada will not make their updated counts available until later today, we foresee this as a ripe opportunity for right-wing chaos agents to spread disinformation the same way that they did in Pennsylvania. We'll be focusing on Facebook and YouTube because both platforms have evaded calls to practice platform transparency during this election because they continue to allow right-wing political content to continue despite promising that they would curb political ads. These companies just need to get it together.
Please, I'm tired. We're also continuing to track hashtag count every vote and those conversations across platforms and the emergence of stop the count protests across the country. We've already tracked conversations in the count every vote hashtag, which have been changing from predominantly progressive to increasingly right-wing.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll definitely keep tracking more of this and real-time updates on tomorrow's episode. But before that, Renee, do you got some more moves? Because I feel like you could teach me something.
Okay, look, we're not doing a Soul Train line today, okay? I don't know what the kids do. EVA loves the woe, so maybe she can give us a little. Woe.
No, I need to go back to doom scrolling about the election. I will see y'all tomorrow, okay?
See you tomorrow.
Have a great rest of your day. Bye,
Bye, everybody.
Perfect.